So in 2020, Pete Buttigieg became the first openly gay presidential candidate and the first presidential candidate in a same-sex marriage to win a presidential primary or caucus in a United States presidential campaign. Might have thought I was going to say he was the first openly gay presidential candidate to run for a major political party. It's honestly what I thought too before I did research for this episode. But actually that distinction goes to Fred Karger and his presidential campaign in 2012. Karger was also running to be on the Republican Party's ticket, which is, well, pretty surprising. There's always some Fred Karger out there who will screw up your assumptions about historical firsts. Anyway, a question more in our wheelhouse is, what about United States politicians who weren't actually openly gay? To me, that's the more interesting question, but also the one that's much trickier to answer. Still, if you use gay USA president as a search term, you'll more than likely come across the same name, James Buchanan. Unfortunately for those of us who like our plucky potential historical minorities to at least be competent and on the right side of civil rights issues, Buchanan is also the president who usually gets the lion's share of the blame for the American Civil War, on top of being an ardent defender of slavery. But let's set the question of who was and who wasn't responsible for one of the first industrialized wars in history, which left around 1 million people dead, aside for now. Let's meet James Buchanan, the son of first-generation Scots-Irish immigrants who lived in Franklin County in south-central Pennsylvania. Some sources make it sound like Buchanan's parents were poor farmers and that he was born in a dingy log cabin, but as is often the case with historical figures in the 19th century United States, Buchanan's poverty and rustic background are slightly exaggerated. In James Buchanan's case, his dad wasn't just a farmer, but also a guy who made a fortune off of real estate and business investments. The thing about James Buchanan's life is that it was pretty queer from almost the beginning. And I mean queer not only in the rainbow flag sense, but in the traditional sense of just odd. I'm specifically referring to James Buchanan's disastrous relationship with a woman, Ann Coleman. Ann was the 23-year-old daughter of a wealthy industrialist, and the two became engaged in the summer of 1819. But Anne herself broke off that engagement just several months later. Not long after that, Anne died. Sources at the time claimed she died of unspecified natural causes, but at least one historian, James Buchanan's modern biographer Gene Baker, thinks it could have been a suicide. It's just no one wanted to admit it was a suicide because, well, it was 1819. Even though their relationship had failed, James Buchanan remarked at Anne's funeral, "I feel happiness has fled from me forever." James Buchanan never became engaged or married or even had a romantic relationship with a woman again. I wish I could tell you why these things happened, but we honestly have no idea. Not why Anne called off the marriage, and not why she may have killed herself, or even if she did indeed commit suicide. Rumors from the time claimed that James Buchanan neglected Anne because he was busy with his burgeoning career as a lawyer, or because, believe it or not, that James was off having sex with other women. Of course, it's also very likely Ann Coleman's death had nothing to do with her ex-fiancé at all. As for me, well, honestly, I think it's reasonable to speculate that the reason Ann Coleman broke off her engagement was because Buchanan told her about his sexual preferences, even if he never acted on them, or she found out some other way. Again, I can't stress enough that is purely speculation on my part. And based on the fact that our definitive evidence amounts to maybe a page, it will almost certainly always be speculation. But that's not the reason why James Buchanan has been recruited post-mortem into the Great Gay Conspiracy. No, it's because of his relationship with William Rufus King, a senator from Alabama who notably became vice president under President Franklin Pierce from 1853 to 1857. I say relatively notably because there isn't much notable about Franklin Pierce. Anyway, the two met after James Buchanan managed to ride his law career and a stint in Pennsylvania's House of Representatives into Congress as a senator from Pennsylvania. Like James Buchanan, William Rufus King was a lifelong bachelor. It was rumored that while he was part of a diplomatic delegation in Russia, that he had a scandalous flirtation with Princess Charlotte of Prussia, just when she was about to marry the future Tsar Nicholas I. But otherwise, as far as we know, he never had an actual relationship with a woman that was romantic or sexual. For 13 years, Rufus King and James Buchanan were a Washington, D.C. power couple. They lived together in a Washington townhouse, either just with each other or with other bachelors in Congress. Also, they would usually show up at parties and official state functions together. It was a relationship that only ended with King's death in April of 1853 from tuberculosis. Now, of course, we have no idea if James Buchanan and Rufus King were ever romantically involved either. There isn't even much evidence in their surviving letters. There's a widespread myth that Buchanan and King's nieces destroyed their letters after their deaths, which might be telling if it wasn't untrue. Instead, most of King's papers were lost in a fire caused during the American Civil War, and later from flood damage. What is true is that very little of what they wrote to each other or about each other survives, and most of it isn't all that suggestive. That said, you do get tidbits like this one letter King wrote to Buchanan while he was serving as a diplomat in Paris. I am selfish enough to hope you will not be able to procure an associate who will cause you to feel no regret at our separation. For myself, I shall feel lonely in the midst of Paris, for here I shall have no friend with whom I shall commune as with my own thoughts. Besides these letters, mostly the proof we do have is even more speculation, albeit speculation from people who were alive at the time and knew them personally. President Andrew Jackson sneeringly called King Miss Nancy, and someone else referred to Buchanan as Aunt Fancy and King as Mrs. B. Buchanan was also just explicitly called King's wife. In a letter, Senator Aaron Brown of Tennessee wrote, "Mr. Buchanan looks gloomy and dissatisfied, and so did his better half." D.C. gossips also remarked that James Buchanan seemed, when he was president, to be really close to his own Secretary of the Treasury, Howell Cobb, although Howell, unlike King, did actually have a wife and children. Kate Thompson, who was married to another member of James Buchanan's cabinet, said there was something unhealthy about President Buchanan. There still are historians who I think protest too much against this interpretation. A recent book titled Bosom Friends, The Intimate World of James Buchanan and William Rufus King by historian Thomas Balkersky suggests that James Buchanan and William Rufus were just exemplifying a close, intimate friendship in a time and culture when such friendships between members of the same sex were much more common. Now, I should probably say I haven't seen anything remotely suggesting Balkersky's research is tainted by some ideological motive to deny that King and Buchanan were lovers. In the late 18th and early mid-19th century in North America and Western Europe, really did see a golden age of such friendships. Plus, at the time, bachelors like Buchanan and King weren't usually thought of as closeted gay men. Instead, they were more likely to be suspected of being Lotharios who didn't want to have to give up their wild sex life for marriage, very much unlike the stereotypes that would dominate in the 20th century. Even so, the existence of such friendships is often used as an excuse to downplay the possibility of sexual relationships in history, even if that isn't Balkersky's intention. Also, I would argue that there are a few flaws in Balkersky's overall argument. If the celebration of close same-sex friendships was a strong part of upper and middle-class culture in the United States at the time, then the fact that members of the DC elite still compared King and Buchanan to a married couple is actually more suggestive, not less. And while slang terms like Miss Nancy or Aunt Fancy could just refer to someone who is effeminate or prissy, they could also be used to literally suggest homosexuality. It's like finding a letter where an old man called his grandson a fairy because said grandson decorated his house according to a Rainbow Bright theme, and arguing that because the Rainbow Bright loving grandson never displayed any sexual attraction to another man in his entire life, it's proof fairy never actually was a slur against gay men. No, I'm not referring to someone I know personally, although if you want to have a Rainbow Bright motif in your life, more power to you. Anyway, as in the case of a lot of historical figures I cover here, we just can't know for sure. In fact, Jane Baker argues that Buchanan was probably asexual in modern terms. And it's honestly more productive to talk about the idea of James Buchanan as the first gay president than whether or not Buchanan was actually gay. Something we'll almost certainly never know. Personally, I think James Buchanan does qualify as a queer president just by the fact he was a lifelong bachelor, whatever the reason. In fact, while James Buchanan may or may not have been gay, he is indisputably one of the only two unmarried presidents in U.S. history, and of those two, the only one to remain unmarried up to his death. By the way, the other bachelor president was Grover Cleveland, who got married to Frances Folsom during his first year in office. Maybe it's just me, but by this point, as a citizen of the United States, it's harder to imagine someone single and without children becoming president than a gay person, as long as that person had a spouse and family. Anyway, I don't think the LGBT community is really in that much of a rush to claim Buchanan, at least not nowadays. He was definitely on the wrong side of one of the United States' worst and most destructive atrocities, slavery. Buchanan was even notorious in his own time for being a doughface, meaning a northerner who sided with southern plantation owners over the slavery issue. It's likely his relationship with King hardened his views, since King was a southern politician who opposed the South seceding, but who also supported slavery and openly despised abolitionists. As president, Buchanan pressured Congress into allowing Kansas to join the United States as a state with legalized slavery. He also asked the Supreme Court to use the Dred Scott case to set a precedent to stop Congress from banning slavery in new American territories, and to prevent freed slaves from receiving American citizenship. On top of all that, he didn't do much to quell the rising call for the southern states to secede. And then there's his mishandling of Kansas, where 5 years of bloody fighting over the issue of slavery would just prove to be a prologue of what was to come. On Buchanan's record as president, Jean Baker writes, "He was that most dangerous of chief executives, a stubborn, mistaken ideologue whose principles held no room for compromise. His experience in government had only rendered him too self-confident to consider other views. In his betrayal of the national trust, Buchanan came closer to committing treason than any other president in American history." And to this day, Buchanan usually tops out historians' lists of the United States' worst presidents. Oh, I should probably note after that quote that Jean Baker's biography was published in 2004. No particular reason, I just think it's important to point that out. Buchanan's years after the presidency, which he spent at his estate Wheatland in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, were largely dedicated to weakly defending his own record as president against those who already called the Civil War Buchanan's War. At best, he was accused of failing to stop the war. At worst, it was said he actively collaborated with the Confederates. He tried to publish a memoir that was supposed to be what we call today a PR blitz, but that didn't stop members of the public from constantly sending him angry letters, even death threats. And stores in his own town put up images of him with the eyes colored out in red, a noose around his neck, and the word traitor written across the forehead. Worn out and depressed, James Buchanan succumbed to pneumonia in June of 1868. I should also mention that while his successor as president, Abraham Lincoln, got a biographical film made about him, directed by no one less than Steven Spielberg, James Buchanan today only has a comedy movie titled Raising Buchanan. It's about a woman who steals Buchanan's remains and tries to hold him for ransom, but nobody cares. But I don't want to end this on a sour note, so let me finish by sharing something from James Buchanan's own letter to a friend during that dark, sad period when his beloved Rufus King was off in Paris. I am now solitary and alone, having no companion in the house with me. I have gone a-wooing to several gentlemen, but have not succeeded with any of them. I feel that it is not good for man to be alone. I should not be astonished to find myself married to some old maid who can provide good dinners for me when I'm well, and not expect from me any very ardent or romantic affection.